Okay, our retro review of the original series, this time The Squire of Gothos after this. Hello out there, I'm the oldest nerd, and The Squire of Gothos, played by William Campbell, was originally written for Roddy McDowall. However, playing a foppish type of character, they were afraid that people would get the wrong impressions back in 1967. So they had, rather than casting Roddy McDowall, they cast William Campbell, who was a larger fellow, more action figure type of fellow who would not lead to that connotation at the time. And as it turns out, he was Bob Justman's favorite all along, and did actually, while he did have to read for the part, after reading about the first line, they decided he was the one for it. There was some conflict between him and William Shatner because of a delay in production for him to get the right wardrobe and such. But his performance, of course, was great, and he himself would say later that his performance was really informed by superior writing, and it was a very well-written show. We find ourselves on the Enterprise headed through a deserted area of space, a star desert, they called it, and after some discussion of what real deserts are like and Spock's observations in that area, they find that suddenly there's a planet, and they don't want to actually explore it. They've got some place they need to be, but Sulu then disappears off the bridge, and shortly thereafter the captain. So what they find is a, who knows, 17th century drawing room, and the Trelane character. Now, Trelane was Probably in the same kind of idea as the Q was later, with Trelane being a near omnipotent being, the same way the Q was, his tendency to want to play games the same way the Q did. He was a little more infantile, and they did, at the end of the episode, identify him as a child. There are some who have said that perhaps this is what the Q are like as children, although it doesn't quite work that way, because the Q are eternal generally, and Eternals don't usually go through growing phases as far as I know. But that's something that's been said about it. A number of interesting little things about this. We see the first appearance of Dusal, who at this time was a navigator. Later he would be an engineer, and he'd be something else later on. He appeared in about 3 episodes. Also, Leslie. Leslie was often put in temporary command, or at least manning the bridge, and we've seen him in 2 or 3 episodes. These are the first appearances for both of them. They are not really very fleshed out characters, but we do see them, and sometimes they get some pretty good lines. And this time it's a good way for Dusal to establish his character, which, as his job changes, his characterization really doesn't. A few things in here as they go into, as they track down where the captain is, and beam down McCoy and Dusal and Yeager. They find themselves in the same drawing room, and as they pass by an exhibit, an alcove, there's the salt monster that was used in the first broadcast episode. And McCoy looks at it and does kind of a double take, a very subtle thing there. Also, there is a bird kind of creature that was used before in the cage, and these, of course, were the reason they were to give some texture to the set, and Star Trek was always known to reuse its props. Interestingly, the way that they recreated things, the form without the substance, is what holodecks would do later, and there's some suggestion that that technology was something that was also thought of near that time in order to, advance the next generation's possibility of stories. They still have a yeoman, different yeoman this time, but still being the victim. Not quite as overt as they did with Janice Rand, but still there. I was not happy with some of the sound effects they had at the first time that they were able to get away from Trelane. They have, a slide whistle and a boing sound, and it seemed a little bit too campy for my taste, but this was supposed to be a lighter kind of comic episode. There were some terminology oddities here, even though Gene Kuhn was already on board as producer, and episodes filmed previous to this had gone beyond this. They were still calling the space service Space Fleet, and they mentioned normal orbit instead of standard orbit, which is kind of interesting. Still kind of in the early days of Trek where they're trying out their terminology, and perhaps all the writers didn't get the memo. They mention that they are 900 years past where Trelane could see, and if that were the case, it would put them in like the 27th century. This is due to the fact, of course, that the show had never really decided what century they were in until later. So they didn't want to say they were 200 years in the future, or 300 or 500 or 900. They just wanted to say distant future. But later on, they decided that they were in the middle 23rd century, and that stuck later on. Also, it was oddity that they mention at the end of the episode childish pranks like dipping a girl's pigtails in an inkwell. In the 21st century, as we live, I don't remember inkwells. I've heard of them, but usually in very old stories then. It wasn't something I would have remembered as a kid. It's certainly something Kirk would not have remembered as a kid, unless there was a complete, crash of Earth sometime in between the great World War III and the rising of the Federation. But at any rate, the inkwell thing was kind of a curiosity near the end, and I had the same reaction as Spock did. What are you talking about? They didn't use environmental suits when they beamed down to the planet, even though they thought it was a poisonous atmosphere. And the reason was a very practical one. The ones that they had used the naked time were basically bubble wrap, and they were afraid that people would notice the suits more than anything else in the episode. So they just gave them some oxygen mask that they took off an airplane somewhere, I think, and made do with that. Later on in the cartoons, they indicated that they had shields that they could put on, and they didn't have to have environmental suits at all. But that's one of the many inconsistencies in Star Trek, whether they need to have actual EV suits or not, as has been an on and off thing. They've used them here and there where they have needed them, and some places have not used them when they could have used them. But most of that has to do with budget and just what an EV suit would look like in the 23rd century. I don't think they ever decided. Another thing that bothered me is while Trelane was no mind reader, he had to be introduced to everyone. He was surprised that he had gotten the captain when he had first snatched him from the bridge. And yet he seemed to know that Spock had a human half. No one introduced Spock to him as being anything but the science officer. And Spock said that he was from Vulcan, but I never told Trelane that he was half human, and yet Trelane presumed that some of his behaviors were due to his human half. A little bit of sloppy writing there. But otherwise, a very memorable episode, and one we recommend to you. It holds up pretty well on repeat viewing, and there are some little things in there that you might not have noticed the first time around. And in light of knowing what the Q character is like, that comparison is inevitable whenever you're watching it. So I invite you to do so. So I thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe to the channel. That helps us out and doesn't cost you anything. So please do so by clicking subscribe or the circle in logo at the corner of the screen. And until next time, don't go far.